It's now 2 o'clock. My name is David Skeel. I'm one of the members of the Oversight Board, and I will very temporarily be overseeing the meeting in the chair's absence. I'd like to welcome all persons present to this meeting of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico, which, as you can see, is being held by video conference. I'd like to begin by asking everybody who is connected to the video conference if you could please cooperate in conducting a productive meeting and a distraction-free meeting if possible, including by keeping yourselves on mute during the video conference. Let me begin by conducting a roll call to determine which members are present and whether we have a quorum for the purposes of the meeting. Dr. Biggs?
Present.
Mr. Garcia?
Present.
Judge Gonzalez?
Present.
Mr. Gonzalez?
Present.
I don't think Ms. Matasantos or Mr. Carrion are here. Are either of you here? But I am here. So we have 5 members present, and we do in fact have a quorum for the purposes of the meeting. So the quorum being present, the meeting is now called to order. I would like to ask Mr. Jaime L. Corey, who is the general counsel for the board, to act as secretary for this meeting, if you are willing.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. El Corey. Since, as I've already noted, the board's chair is away today and not able to attend the meeting, I'll entertain a motion to designate a chair pro tempore for the meeting, if I can have that motion.
Mr. Skeel, I'd like to make the motion. It's Arthur Gonzalez. I'd like to make the motion that Carlos Garcia be designated as chair pro tempore of the board for this meeting.
Thank you, Judge Gonzalez. I'll second that motion.
All right. I'd like to take a vote. Those in favor, please say yes. Those opposed, please say no.
Yes.
Yes.
I vote yes. All right, and the motion has passed. And Mr. Garcia has been elected chair pro tempore of the board for this meeting. I turn it over to today's chair.
Thank you very much, Judge Gonzalez, and thank you very much, David, for opening the meeting. Thanks to all of you in attendance at this public meeting being held by video conference, and those watching the live stream of the meeting via the board's website at www.oversightboard.pr.gov. I'm pleased to say that the audio of this meeting via the webcast is available in English and a simultaneous Spanish translation, as well as being translated in sign language. If you log in to the English website, the audio will be in English, and if you log in to the Spanish website, you will hear the simultaneous translation. The Oversight Board will be handling the public questions and comments through a form available on the board's website by clicking the webcast page. Please fill the form, including your name and any questions or comments, and the board will answer them during the assigned time period. The public will have, from the time that the meeting starts, up to 15 minutes prior to the public comment period starts to share their questions or comments on these forms. Questions that cannot be answered during the meeting due to time constraints will be later answered and published on the website. I would like to start by recognizing the presence of the Honorable Francisco Pares Alicea, Secretary of the Department of the Treasury, who will be joining us today for today's meeting. So welcome, Secretary. Today, the following topics are part of the board's public meeting agenda. Topic number 1 is the approval of the minutes of the public meeting and executive sessions of the board. Topic number 2 will be administrative matters. Topic number 3 will be action plan for the completion of the Commonwealth Comprehensive Annual Financial Reports. Topic number 4 will be the Pharma and Manufacturing Report. Topic number 5 will be the status of the Commonwealth agency consolidations. Topic number 6 will be the annual report update. Topic number 7 will be the public comments period, and then we'll have the last, which will be other matters if we have any to cover. So let's move on to the first order of business, which are the approval of the minutes. So the minutes of the board's last meeting held on July 1st, 2020, and the minutes of the board's executive session held on the dates listed on Appendix A to the board members' packages. The proposed minutes are included in your materials. Minutes are attached here too as Appendix B also. Does anyone have any questions about the minutes? If there are no questions, I would like to ask for a motion to approve the minutes.
I would like to move to approve the minutes of the board's public meeting held on July 1st, 2020, and the minutes of the board's executive session held on dates listed in Appendix A in the form presented to the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Vic. Does anyone want to second that motion? I think, David, you're mute. Yeah.
First, I will unmute and then I will second the motion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Then let's just have a vote by voice. Sorry. First, those in favor, please say yes.
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 Any opposed, please say no. Okay, all of the members having voted in favor of the motion, the minutes are approved. So let's move on to the second topic, which are the administrative matters. I will now recognize Mr. Andrew Biggs.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to make the following motion. Between the adjournment to this meeting and the opening of the board's next public meeting, the board may consider in executive session any and all matters that it is authorized to consider under PROMESA, including first, any certification determinations authorized PROMESA, including certification determinations under Section 206 of PROMESA. Second, any submissions or authorizations authorized per PROMESA. And third, any filings authorized under Title III of PROMESA in each case that are set forth as part of the vote to convene such executive session. The board may also act by unanimous written consent between meetings in accordance with the bylaws, with such consent to include consent by electronic transmission.
Do we have anybody second that motion, please?
Yes, this is Arthur Gonzalez. I second the motion.
Thank you, Judge Gonzalez. So then I will ask for a vote by voice. First, those in favor, please say yes.
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 Anybody opposed, please say no. All of the members having voted in favor of the motion, the resolution is also approved. Thank you. Okay, so let's then move on to the third topic, which is the action plan for the completion of the Commonwealth Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Secretary of the Treasury, Francisco Pares, for being here today with us, and the people of Puerto Rico to engage again on the very important issue of the comprehensive annual financial reports of the government of Puerto Rico. As previously communicated to you, we would like to work with you, Mr. Secretary, to finally put to rest the chronic delay in the issuance of the CAFRs by expediting the issuance of the fiscal years 2017, 2018, and 2019, while becoming current on fiscal year 2020 with the ultimate goal of implementing best practices with regards to fiscal year 2021 and issuing within 6 months of the close of the fiscal year. When we met a month ago, we agreed that you would identify what had to change in order to enable this to happen. Late last week, the board received your proposal, which we thank you. Nevertheless, your proposal fails to meet the expectations of the board's request in terms of timing, specific change in the process, so you can obtain a different and favorable result, or consequences for the responsible persons and agencies and instrumentalities that do not deliver the financial statements within the required timelines. Today, Ms. Jaresco will quickly review the current status of the CAFRs for the fiscal years 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020, and will provide specific recommendations to improve the issuance process, as well as some next steps, including a revised required timeline. I hope that you, Mr. Secretary, and Mr. Marrero, as Executive Director of AFAB and Financial Advisor to the Government of Puerto Rico, take these recommendations seriously and provide a precise, actionable plan within the next 15 days without any further delays. As we all know, this is a very serious matter. Ms. Jaresco, please proceed with your review.
Thank you. To quickly recap for those who might have been unable to participate in the last meeting, at this moment, the government has yet to issue the CAFRs for fiscal year 2017, although these you've mentioned should be issued later this month. You have also mentioned, Mr. Secretary, that some of the audit work has commenced in connection with the fiscal year 2018 CAFRs, and that you expect to issue the same by April 2021. Although, even with your proposed remedies, you expect to issue fiscal year 2019 CAFRs only by January 31st, 2022. There was no mention in your report of fiscal year 2020, nor a plan to issue fiscal year 2021 within a reasonable period of time in accordance with best practices. It's been over 1,000 days, 3 years, since the close of fiscal year 2017, and the financial statements for the fiscal year 2017 are still waiting to be issued. It's been over 700 days since the close of fiscal year 2018, and over a year since the close of fiscal year 2019. And again, no comprehensive annual financial reports are in sight. Mr. Secretary, you submitted a project plan that focused mainly on outlining the root causes of the delay in issuance in the CAFRs. And we believe that you explained many of them in your document last month as well. The root causes that in general are included in your documents are first, that there are, and we agree, indeed too many different auditors, and the number needs to be reduced for the sake of reducing the coordination effort and time required. Currently, there are over 26 auditors of major components. Second, the manual process of outputs that's required for financial statement preparation is slowing down your processes. We understand that. Third, the fact that there are 6 different accounting systems that don't speak to one another complicate the process further. Fourth, that there has been an over-reliance on contractors, and that has left internal resources without the competencies necessary for audit preparation. Fifth, that there are auditor-identified weaknesses that remain unresolved to this day. And so we want to focus on those, on the proposed remedies to these root causes of delay. Your proposal, Mr. Secretary, includes the following types of remedies. First, in the category of those with which we fully agree. We agree there is a need to strengthen the internal resources for the financial statement preparation, but would like a plan as to how you intend to do this in the immediate term. Second, we recognize the importance of targeting monthly accounting closing procedures and ensure that this implementation will occur immediately. Third, we understand that there needs to be the restructuring of agency operations in accordance with the fiscal plan to reduce the number of financial statements that come into this process, though this is a medium-term solution, not an immediate one. Fourth, there's a need to implement a centralized ERP, or enterprise resource planning system, for component units and agencies. Again, this being a medium-term solution, not an immediate one. And fifth, that there is a need to conduct an assessment for product standardization in the immediate term. However, there was a request in your proposal for resources to hire an incremental 150 employees under Treasury to provide support for component units, about 75 component units, about 2 employees per component unit. In order to fully understand this request, we would ask that you justify that in the documents in the next 2 weeks, such that it's clear what the job scopes of these folks would be, how their addition would actually enable the CAFRs to be issued on time, and how making this change now would enable us to achieve the goals, the urgent and immediate goals. The second that would require additional justification is the creation of a PMO office to oversee this audit process. In particular, what this means if you have a financial reporting unit. Who's going to staff which office? Who is going to report to which of the entities? what is the scope of authority of each of the entities, and how will adding this office enable you to complete the CAFRs on a much more accelerated time schedule. And lastly, with regard to creation, as you suggest, of a financial reporting unit within Treasury, as I mentioned, it's not clear how this unit would work or would have authority with or over the PMO office, such that there's no duplication of effort, and clear lines of authority to improve the process and get the CAFRs done would be complete. With regard to several of the other remedies that you mentioned, we are not clear that they are sufficient or necessary. First, with regard to your proposal that central accounting monitor, there's no clear consequences to the monitoring actions, and there are no clear consequences to the component units that are not actually complying with your schedule. In terms of Treasury's increased oversight over accounting procedures, you haven't addressed the underlying procedural weaknesses within the agencies and the component units. You mentioned yourself the weakness, but we're not addressing how to eliminate those weaknesses or remove them, whether they be how they record transactions, how they do adjusting entries, the staff competencies, or the closing. Even with all of these proposed remedies in your proposals, Mr. Secretary, assuming they were all put in place, you still project the completion of the fiscal year 19 audit only to be completed by January 31st, 2022, or 31 months after the close of the fiscal year. The proposal does accelerate the process, but it does not put us back on a path to best practices and issuance of our CAFRs within 6 months of the fiscal year end close. It is not an acceptable outcome. And with that in mind, we'd like to suggest that there may be other critical elements that should be taken into account in your change of process, which might lead to the outcome that we all seek: timely issuance of the CAFRs. First, what we're suggesting and recommending to you to include is that the Puerto Rico Treasury Department use external resources to simultaneously work on the completion of the financial statements for fiscal years 2018 and 2019. Separately and simultaneously, focus your internal resources at the Treasury Department on completion of the fiscal year 2020 financial statements and preparing the 2021 accounting work that would enable us to be assured that the 2021 statements would happen on a best practices basis. We believe that only by reorganizing these two work streams and managing them concurrently would the government of Puerto Rico be able to complete the outstanding financial statements so much needed for transparency and credibility and for returned access to financial markets. Given the complexity of managing so many auditors, we do agree that as you complete these delayed CAFRs, you then look at reducing the number of audit firms and include multi-year audit contracts, master audit contracts for component units to be established. On an urgent basis, given the complexity of all the manual processes in place, regular monthly financial closings must be conducted throughout all component units, including bank account reconciliations, which will reduce the time-consuming processes at year-end. And given the internal control reports or the management letters of your past audits, they've established different areas for corrective action. We believe that those corrective actions need to be included into this process and corrected as soon as possible. Given the lack of compliance that you've outlined in your proposal and that we understand is contributing to the delay at the different component units, we believe that much stricter monitoring of compliance must be required with regularly published schedules noting any delays, published so that the transparency to the public is clear of who is causing delays and what type of delay they're causing, but also that there have to be very specific, defined consequences for failure to meet defined key performance indicators. Not just making leadership aware, but taking actions with regard to those who have not complied. You mentioned Act 2 of 2017, Act 230 of 1974 in your proposal, but none of them actually identify what the specific consequence for a delay of X number of days will be for any agency head. So we're looking for very specific consequences for lack of implementation. And finally, given the difficulty of providing centralized guidance and oversight over the process over the past 4 years, the board wants to reiterate that the Office of the CFO should be legislated per the Certified Fiscal Plan and should have centralized authority over the CAFR process, over all the component units and their accounting, as well as the necessary resources to make this happen. The overall plan that we are recommending to you takes into account many of the issues that you raised, the remedies that you suggested, which we understand and we understand that this is the only path that will get us to issuance of the comprehensive annual financial reports on a timely basis and returning to best practices. To summarize the steps to become current, you would need to hire contractors who are focused solely on completing and driving the 2018 and 2019 audits to completion. They would have to work on those two audits simultaneously, not waiting to do them consecutively. You'd have to strengthen your internal staff capacity as you suggest and the technical competencies to align with updated policies and procedures in light of the ERP system. You'd have to implement contracting best practices with a multi-year master audit contract, inclusive of pre-qualified contractors selected through a competitive bidding process. You'd have to revamp closing procedures with the adoption of recurring monthly closings at the agency and component unit level. And you should enforce centralized monitoring with consequences achieved eventually through a strong legislated OCFO function. By reorganizing the work streams for the 2018 and 2019 fiscal year financial statements separately from those of the fiscal year 2020, the Oversight Board proposes that the government of Puerto Rico finalize the statements as follows. Fiscal year 2017, as you've stated, by August 31st. But fiscal year 2018 by November 30th, 2020, and fiscal year 2019 by December 31st of this year. Putting all of the previous CAFRs behind us before the end of this calendar year. Then further, working now, the FY20 financial statements should be worked on by internal resources and then finalized and issued by March 31st of 2021. And similarly, then you could strive such that by June of next year, you would be beginning a process that would end in issuance by December 31st, 2021 on the basis of best practices. But this timeline can only work, in our view, if you work simultaneously on the work streams, if you divide who's responsible for each of the work streams, and if you use consequences to ensure that every component unit and agency is reporting on a timely basis. It is the only way we believe you can become current and achieve best practice standards with regard to issuance of the CAFRs. And we understand that the proposal that was presented by the Treasury Department at this point does not provide a sufficient set of remedies to resolve the continuing unreasonable delay in issuance of the statements, and it's insufficient to meet the above timeline. And as a result, we believe that to achieve these results, you would need to urgently hire the group of contractors to complete the 18 and 19 CAFRs, require immediately the implementation and monitoring of monthly closings at the component units, establish very specific corrective actions for areas of improvement already identified in prior years, either through internal control reports or management letters, properly define the capacity needs and the estimated cost of those capacity needs, such that hiring and budget can be justified based on job scopes and based on the requirements to complete audits. Reduce the number of component units auditors and establish that multi-year master audit contract, and prepare a master schedule with the timelines of all data to be received from all component units so that it's clear. The Oversight Board has and will continue to provide support by authorizing a focused and experienced team to work with you on the ERP system and the enhancement of these processes, providing you funding for the ERP Wave 2 by February of 2021, providing this year already budgeted an additional $2 million for additional staff accountants in the Central Accounting Office. And I'll complete with that and ask whether the board members have any questions or comments.
This is Jose Gonzalez. Let me start it off, if I may, by asking a question about the obvious obstacle that we have in front of us now, but that we need to find a way to work around it, Mr. Secretary, and that is the demands of the post-COVID-19 workspace. Obviously, it does not make easier all of the tasks we have identified, but we also cannot continue delaying necessary tasks. And we need to begin addressing workarounds or working in this environment. How do you view this? Have you taken any measures to manage these circumstances? How do you propose to address these concerns?
In terms of COVID-19, we have established an internal process that actually allows the different areas to work remotely. We have been investing in the infrastructure for our employees to actually work from their homes. Certainly, it's been quite a challenge, specifically to the accounting area, because as you are aware, there are no employees, career employees that actually are working, putting together the financial information. We have close to 30 employees. None of them are related to the division that actually puts in place the financial reporting. That's why we have been relying too much on consultants. With respect to the implementation of the protocol, I must say that we have been impacted by COVID-19 infections. We have been facing employees in Hacienda that has their results ended in positive tests. So certainly they must quarantine and make the proper arrangements. And as a matter of fact, affects the operation within Hacienda, not only in the central accounting, but as well in the other areas within the department. We have put in place certain tools that actually reduce the likelihood of having more personnel within Hacienda infected by COVID-19, but we do recognize that this is not the only actions that actually precludes people to get infected. And there are many other challenges that are not in our hands to reduce the likelihood of that. So resuming my briefing, giving you a briefing, certainly it has been a challenge from an operational standpoint. It actually affects the operation not only in the central accounting area, but we have been investing resources to actually reduce the likelihood of having our operation significantly impacted by this. But it's quite a challenge.
But it has not completely stopped the process. You are striving to continue the process even within these constraints, I gather from your comments.
Yep, certainly. However, we did face some delay, specifically with the roles of the contractors, because many of them are physically present in the different agencies, and many of the agencies were not operating. So this affects the operation that we have faced. If we didn't face the COVID-19, my guess is that we will be able, we will have been able to issue the financial statements by April, close to April. So certainly the COVID-19 has made some effect, not only in the Puerto Rico Treasury Department, but as well to our external auditors and the component units. So it's more than the Department of Treasury. We are talking about an external auditor that is facing an administrative lockdown within the firm that doesn't provide or doesn't allow them to visit the field work. And as you may know, there are portions of the audits that actually requires field visits, and it's been a challenge on that end. We will be facing them specifically for the 2018 audit procedures.
Mr. Secretary, I hear you. I would, however, emphasize the following. I myself have been through an SEC filing process, the 10K year end back in April, and now a quarterly going on now with external auditors, with full audit review, et cetera. And the audit firms have, in fact, been able to develop procedures to do remote work. and we have had to develop procedures to do remote work with 100% of workforce working remote. So it is obviously an obstacle, but it is not a complete impediment to doing this. And if you follow most, the vast majority of public companies or filing entities, everybody has been complying even from remote posture. So I would urge you to be sure you press the contractors and the outside resources and the auditors that they find a way to work in this from this posture, because it's certainly being done around the market. So thank you.
Any questions from any other board members to the Secretary of the Treasury? Mr. Secretary, I do have one question. I had the opportunity to review the KPMG management letter issued last year, July 3rd, 2019, in regards to the audit of 2016. And that letter has very precise recommendations in order to improve the process of completing the financial statements. I mean, one specific that I know has been a chronic problem is making sure that all agencies and instrumentalities do balance sheet reconciliations on a monthly basis and not on an annual basis, which is obviously the basis for making sure that you're progressing in the process. So I have just the general questions in terms of, have you responded already to the management letter recommendations of KPMG? And if you have responded, I mean, what is the current status of the implementation of all the corrective actions identified in this management letter?
So with respect to the letter, yes, my team has responded to the auditors. Basically, the reconciliations made by auditors in their analysis is done once per year, as the agencies doesn't perform necessarily a conversion on a monthly basis. So that's something that we have been discussing with the agencies and with the auditors. And other aspect of this, if we need to review the process, we need to review the policy decision that was made back in the mid 1990s, when most of the duties, the pre-intervention duties, were actually designated to the corresponding agencies. So the accounting processes were decentralized from the Puerto Rico Treasury Department to actually make the corresponding agencies to perform the necessary jobs to actually do the pre-intervention process. This was based most probably back then with respect to the staffing that was in place in Hacienda and was in place in the different agencies. Obviously, the scenario right now, it's quite different. So we delegated those functions to the agencies, and the usual suspect is the understaffing right now due to many actions, the normal attrition and different actions that actually reduce the staffing to perform these duties at the level of the agencies. This is also a symptom that we have identified within the corresponding with the corresponding component units. Most of the component units, if we go right now and intervene them, most probably they will be very behind in the accounting aspects. That's why we are saying in our documents that we need the proper staffing to actually monitor the process on a more timely fashion with respect to the corresponding units. It's quite frankly a challenge with the staffing that we have in place right now, because our staffing, specifically the independent contractors, they are focused on putting together the financial statements and helping the agencies to put together the necessary accounting elements that we need to have in order to proceed with the corresponding audit fieldwork.
Mr. Secretary,
Mhm.
if I may, Mr. Chairman, the question that we would need to understand is hiring additional people at central accounting at Treasury to monitor is one element, and I understand that. But still, the accounting departments of the component units need to do the work themselves, including monthly closings and monthly bank reconciliations. And so cannot the central accounting office instruct them, do a training session for them, do something to enable them to do the work that they need to do that's been identified as some of the major impediments to timely financial statements? Because the monitoring is kind of after the fact. They didn't do it, now we know they didn't do it. But how do we get to the point where they're actually doing it themselves?
Actually, the role of these employees, because how it works, the Governmental Accounting Act from back in the decade on 1960s, 70s, it actually makes responsible the Secretary of the Puerto Rico Treasury to do the corresponding accounting reporting for the government of Puerto Rico. These responsibilities are delegated within the other agencies and including the component units. However, we are of the opinion that we can have a more active interaction and more active intervention with respect to the component units, specifically for the financial reporting. So if we have a proper staffing within the central accounting area within the Puerto Rico Treasury Department, and there are career employees with all the duties and responsibilities of a career employee, we can not only monitor that, but actually take the proper actions and corresponding actions to make sure that the accounting reporting is done on a timely fashion.
I mean, it just
Some
seems,
examples.
Mr. Secretary, it just seems that this is a normal procedure that needs to be put in place for every component unit to do monthly closings and monthly bank reconciliation.
Yep, certainly. I do agree with that. Obviously, there are other challenges, specifically with the Central Accounting Act, because in the past has been regulated through circular letters, but we don't have, let's say, a regulation that actually provides how we are going to administer, for example, the administrative fines for not complying with the act that are included in the central accounting. So right now, I have the power in law to issue the administrative fines and take the corresponding action. However, there's a risk of not giving the corresponding officers the due process. So we are actually in the process of drafting a regulation that actually provides the whole framework on how we are going to implement this administrative course of action, but certainly we need people to implement those. And obviously issue a regulation that establishes the rules when the component units and agencies doesn't fulfill their responsibilities with respect to the delegation that was made back in the 1990s specifically. And other thing, with technology, we can be in a better position to change the landscape of the delegation of the pre-intervention process within the agencies. With the ERP project, if we can put in place the ERP and we have proper staffing within the central accounting area, we can absorb that work stream from the agencies, which we are of the opinion that the agencies, they are focused in many aspects from an operational standpoint and administrative standpoint. But the central accounting area has this peculiarity that they are focused strictly on reporting. And that in that way, we can have proper resources that are only focused on this on these duties.
Mr. Secretary, to take it again back to I guess what's the purpose of this meeting, not only to debate very specific points. So the first question is, I hope you understand why we're disappointed with the remedy plan that you send us that doesn't get us in terms of the timing and doesn't provide an acceptable response to be able to get that. First of all, it doesn't recommend enough structural changes in the processes in order to be able to get a different result. I mean, you're asking for more staff, which I mean, we understand and it's probably required, but there are changes in processes and accountability that are required that were lacking in your plan. Also, we believe, and I hope that you agree, that if you want to try to complete these financial statements, you need to be able to tackle these on a simultaneous manner. I mean, if you wait, which has been the issue of getting done 1 year to start the next year, to start the following year, this continues to be a process that is taking 3 years or more to be able to complete. So what we want to be sure is that you're clear in what are the very specific recommendations that the board is providing, which were read by Ms. Jaresco. And what we're asking from you and with the support of Mr. Marrero is to sit down, look over those and come back with a plan that addresses what we requested last month. Because I mean, we believe that the remedies that you provided are not ambitious enough and doesn't get Puerto Rico to where it needs to get. It is still doing some things in addition, but not sufficient to be able to get us in a year to be on a timely manner, producing financial statements and be able to change the process, which the constraints that you have. Because I mean, I understand there are constraints that might be addressable, some are not, but then you need to plan around those so you can get a different result.
Understood. We will take a look on that. We will analyze how can we implement those recommendations. The representations made on the documents sent to the board were based on numerous interviews with respect to experts on this. For the concurrent review, certainly that's something that we are analyzing specifically for 2019 and 2020, because the 2018 job work, it's almost or it's closer to actually finalize rather than to start a comprehensive process with 2018, 2019. The board will issue their recommendations. We will take a closer look and revisit that as well. But what concerns me with respect to the concurrent portion, it's the actual resources available in the island, not only for the preparation of the financial information and the accounting aspect, but also for the external auditors. In the past, they have some external auditors has relied in external people to visit the island, and that produced certain challenges, specifically for the audit procedures. Typically, this approach helps or are better implemented when we are talking about managerial roles within the external auditors, from manager, senior manager in their external audits. Certainly, it's more challenging when we are talking about fieldwork because this staffing that it's new needs to have to comprehend the cultural environment and also all the operational aspect and operational challenges that distinguish us. I do agree that there are many entities, specifically from the private sector, that can issue their corresponding financial information audited or reviewed on a timely fashion. And I do understand that they were better prepared to face the COVID challenges due to technology, technology that we don't have in place here in Hacienda and in the component unit. So certainly I want to review this. Obviously, this urged me, if the board is not perceiving that for me this is a priority, it's a misunderstanding. Certainly, for me, quite frankly, this is very important, and I want to produce positive results as we were able to produce other positive results within the Treasury Department. But quite frankly, based on our interviews, based on our experience right now, I was able to have a 1 year experience on all the challenges that that I faced as secretary to issue the 2017 reporting, the timeline that the board has right now was based on those things. If the things change dramatically, or we are able to actually agree to the board's plan, certainly we can implement those.
Mr. Chairman, may I say something?
Yes, please.
Mr. Secretary, I understand the obstacles that you have articulated. I think the board recognizes those. And I accept your commitment to accomplish the goal. What is frustrating and disappointing, it seems to me that the government, and it's not just this administration, I think it's prior administrations, have not made this a priority. It just seems that if it were made a priority historically, the problem would be at least solved, or if not solved, nearly solved. And the importance of this doesn't seem to be appreciated, in that to the extent Puerto Rico wants to return to the capital markets, you're going to need to get this done on a timely basis. You've already defaulted. You, the Commonwealth, has defaulted in the capital markets. The capital markets need to get assurances to re-engage with the debt to be issued in the future by Puerto Rico. So you're only, not you personally, but the government's, I think, lack of prioritization for this is only delaying what the ultimate goal should be, and that is returning to the capital markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Gonzalez. Mr. Marrero, as financial advisor to the government and as a member of this board, is there any comments you want to make in regards to the board's recommendation and reaction to the remedy plan that was received from the Secretary of the Treasury?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the oversight board for the public meeting, and thank you, the Secretary, for his participation. I think that as we all know, since fiscal year 2014, the time to issue the Commonwealth financial statement has tripled for 11 to 33 months. The government goal has always been to reduce this time and to ultimately moving to industry best practices, but certainly currently lacks that framework to achieve that goal. We are ready to support the Secretary of the Treasury. We have been supporting him in many other respects. I do agree with him in the respect that this is a priority of utmost importance for the government of Puerto Rico, as Mr. Judge Gonzalez just mentioned. This is not only a nice thing to have, this is a requirement of any issuer in the capital markets. And unfortunately, Puerto Rico has been failing in that regard, not only this administration, prior administrations. However, I think that in the last 11 to 12 months, both the Secretary and myself, as well as our teams, we have been trying to prioritize this endeavor within, among many other priorities. Fortunately, when we came, it was part of the political transition. We weren't expecting many of the things that came in January and then with the COVID-19. However, we just remain committed to it. We at FOMB, we are working in an oversight framework that we provided, and I believe the Secretary included in his presentation several of the slides or of the objectives or the design of that framework. But essentially, what we want is to establish an oversight framework in collaboration with the Secretary of the Treasury, as well as the Oversight Board, that will be launched immediately. Obviously, with this recommendation that you have provided and that the Executive Director went through, we will look at it and see how we can fine tune what we were looking to establish as a framework. Obviously, the Secretary mentioned major challenges that he believes and he's certain that he will be able to handle in the medium term to long term, to the extent that he has more resources and that we can obviously make the government agencies accountable. And that's precisely at what FOMB is looking at. It's looking how we can establish not only the implementation governance of this plan that the secretary just mentioned, we're looking to see how we can ramp up the monitoring and the reporting, not necessarily in a reactive fashion, as the executive director mentioned, the fact that monitoring comes normally after happen. So we're looking at how we can do sub-recipient monitoring, similar to what we did at Core 3, similar to what we're doing with the CRF funding. So again, policies, procedures, we have to step up, and the secretary has been doing an enormous job in that respect, but obviously other priorities have been fighting for that. And last but not least, something that you mentioned in the past, in the last meeting, something that I agree personally, I mentioned it, and something that it was implemented in the past, enforcement mechanisms for ongoing compliance. And again, I have to highlight those enforcement mechanisms. We are fine-tuning those enforcement mechanisms, not only which could stem from a FOMB Organic Act or Act 2 of 2017, but also from the regulation promulgated thereunder. We believe that we could have the necessary mechanisms to meet our oversight responsibility and enforce implementation. For example, some elements that we are considering is that each agency, not only they have to do it for the Secretary of for the Department of Treasury, but also for FOB, to have a single financial liaison to respond to everything. We already have one, but sometimes we have several liaisons. The Secretary could have one, a FOB could have one, or even the Oversight Board could have someone at each agency handling or being responsible for that information. We want that the reporting required by this PMO structure will ensure transparency and accountability. And also, we want to make sure that, as I said, the enforcement mechanism, penalties, we have to provide the right incentives and disincentives to those agencies that are not complying, which could be that the OMB retain budgetary items, that AFA will have to grant or approve contracting, that we can reorder the use of funds within an agency with the collaboration of the Oversight Board, that AFAF of the Treasury Department, depending of which mechanism we decide, could even take control of the Finance and Accounting Department of that government agency, because in the end, we are at a financial and fiscal emergency. We have to take extreme measures. And last but not least, to what extent it could be necessary to reorder or order the restructuring of an agency, of the internal functioning of an agency. I think that in the end, if none of this mechanisms help, we could even consider appointing a receiver at any government agency that will not be fulfilling their obligation. We have done it. We did it at one time when PREPA was not fulfilling their procurement obligations, even though we believe we are already past that. We know that the Oversight Board recently said that was not necessarily the case, but again, we have that mechanism, we have that option. So again, in sum, we are looking in many ways to support the Secretary. We have been in talks, we provided feedback to his plan. I think that from the Secretary perspective, and I think I have to highlight the honesty, the work ethic, and the integrity of the Secretary Perez as a public servant. He's not promising in the sky. He's not promising that he will make it happen in a weekend. He's trying to be as honest and responsible as he can be. And I think we all have to commend him for that. And that's why, again, we're looking at regulatory, administrative, and legal ways to enforce and make sure that he has the right tools, not only to fulfill his obligation, but also to make sure that component unit and other agencies are fulfilling their obligations as well.
We're hearing you, Mr. Marrero, but we have heard a lot of those promises before. And I think the board and the people of Puerto Rico are a little bit tired of just waiting for things to happen. I think what we're asking are just very concrete actions. We have presented very concrete recommendations. We think it is doable that you could get all these financial statements if you get, I know you guys have the commitment, but you gotta put the process in place. So what we're asking you is in the next 15 days, you have the concrete recommendations that have been provided. Please look at those and come back to us in 15 days, not with a 50 or 60 page presentation, with a 2 or 3 page presentation that outlines these are the processes that we're going to be undertaking. These are the timelines. These are the things that we need to do. These are the resources that we need, and this is the timeline that we're committing to. So I think this is all too important. I mean, I think we, the board, and everybody in Puerto Rico wants this board to go away and give back a lot of the things that the government of Puerto Rico should be doing. But if the government of Puerto Rico continues to be delayed by 3 years or more in providing their financial statements, this board is never going to go away. So this is why this has to be a priority. And there are executive orders, there's working with the legislature, there are a lot of things that you all can do. I think it's just a time for action now. So I will leave it here. I thank the Secretary of the Treasury for his presentation and for your comments. And please come back in the next 15 days with that concrete actions that will get us to where we need to be. I mean, this has to be the utmost priority for everybody at this point. So thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to the next topic in the agenda, which is the Pharma and Manufacturing Report. And as you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has made it apparent that most raw materials and medical products necessary to ensure national security are manufactured in China, India, and other countries outside the US. This represents a unique opportunity for Puerto Rico as a capable and reliable venue for manufacturing under the US flag. I would like to ask Ms. Jaresco to provide context to today's discussion in this topic. Please, Ms. Jaresco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right at the onset of this pandemic, the Oversight Board wrote to President Trump and congressional leadership encouraging proactive dialogue between the government of Puerto Rico and federal policymakers to find mutually acceptable solutions to enable and attract increased manufacturing of pharmaceuticals and medical products within the United States, and in particular in Puerto Rico. The Oversight Board strongly believes that Puerto Rico is a center of pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturing excellence within the nation and should play a leading role in the national portfolio of locations as this manufacturing relocates. The decades of experience in these sectors, the well-trained human capital, the ready and present physical infrastructure, critical infrastructure necessary for transport, as well as regulatory processes, are already established and well-positioned. Moreover, as part of the implementation of the 2020 fiscal plan, the Oversight Board conducted a comprehensive study to update the facts and acquire the knowledge necessary for the private sector and the government to define a comprehensive and actionable plan to reactivate the manufacturing sector in Puerto Rico. To do so, the Oversight Board hired an expert team from Boston Consulting Group to present a fact-based, apolitical report on the opportunity to bring pharma and medical device manufacturing to Puerto Rico in light of national concerns regarding supply chain security. Carlos, you're on mute. Carlos? You're on mute, Carlos.
My apologies. Thank you, Ms. Jaresco. I will now like to ask the team from the Boston Consulting Group to present the report findings, followed by questions and answers from members of the board. So please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you can't hear me, please let me know. We good?
We can
Okay,
hear
great.
you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to the board and the team for supporting Puerto Rico on this important project. Let me begin by just setting a few pieces of context and then ask the team to walk us through some of the more detailed analysis. If we can move forward, I believe 2 slides. One more slide, please. So just to give some context for what we have done, based on the ask of the board, we launched into what we call a 4-week rapid assessment, really looking at the best path forward for Puerto Rico in the context of potentially pending legislation and broader trends that are creating new momentum for an inshoring of pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturing activity. We did this in 3 elements. So the first is looking at the product companies and product segments that are most likely to be impacted and thus potentially pursue inshoring into the United States. And you'll see us talk about, my colleague Aaron Snyder will be driving some of that conversation, is one of the leaders in our healthcare manufacturing practice. And you'll see him talk about a product story versus a company story, as really looking at which of those products that are going to be most impacted given the criticality and the essential nature of those products, and thus lead to opportunities based on the companies producing those products. With that in mind, and understanding what the most likely wave of products and companies will be, we looked at the specific positioning of Puerto Rico to understand what the opportunities for Puerto Rico might be among that wave of products. And then lastly, we added the important layer of looking at the economic impact of the current alternative federal legislation being proposed to provide additional incentives for some of this inshoring of manufacturing. And we focused on creating an understanding what the most likely legislation might be to come to pass, and most importantly, what the relative impact specifically for Puerto Rico would be under either of those legislative or any of those legislative scenarios. If you go to the next slide. To do this, we made a few key assumptions that will frame the rest of the discussion that we're having. There are lots of conversations and lots of proposals on the table related to legislation to actually support some of this inshoring. We focused on what we have heard in the market in our conversations from industry, company experts, as well as those in the policy world on what we're calling a middle of the road option, which would look at incentivizing return of certain elements of production rather than what we've labeled as forced localization or more extreme measures that would actually require a return, for example, full supply chains within the US. So all of this conversation you're going to see is predicated on that middle of the road option that will create incentives for companies to think about returning to the US, though with some financial benefit, versus being required to come back to the US, which would create a whole set of additional opportunity, given that a lot of companies would have no choice or have much more incentive to have to think about returning some of their production to the US. Importantly, there are different legislation elements being considered, and we also made an assumption around all of those legislative options, including Puerto Rico, and its territory, and the different company types within its benefits. And we'll talk more about that when John Cox, one of our public sector partners and tax experts, will talk about some of those implications. So let me turn it over to Aaron to start talking through the presentation.
Perfect, and hopefully folks can hear me okay. Assuming so, I think just before we leave this page, this is a very important one, because the idea of if you were further to the right, as Danny said, you would end up with more impact. Whether or not we end up there from mandates or federal legislation, the industry is not expecting us to end up there. So I think it has an impact on who you approach first and how you approach them. Because if they're not expecting you to go there and you come with the messages around that, they're expecting much more a middle of the road and are in a bit of a wait and see mode to see what actually comes to pass in reality from the federal agenda. So if you move to the next page, I'm going to give a flavor of how we approach this, and we'll only be able to do a little bit of it justice in a short amount of time. But first, as Danny said, we looked at what was most likely to move in the current context. First, medical necessity. And even with a COVID overlay for something like this, what is most likely to have to be available in the US? And then looked at impetus to change, the magnitude of the supply chain risk, as well as the ease to adjust supply chain. So again, first idea is what's most likely to move or be impacted. Next, took the lens of Puerto Rico. Where does Puerto Rico have a right to win within these spaces? Where does that ecosystem and all of the benefits that Mr. Esco mentioned at the beginning play a bigger role versus a smaller role in some other types of products or modalities? And where's Puerto Rico's value proposition, both for who's already on the island, who's not? How does it compare to other US options for folks that are trying to insure in the US? And then lastly, how can Puerto Rico approach these companies? What are the right messages to bring at this period of time? How would you prioritize with limited resources? And then lastly, as Danny said up front, What are the implications for federal actions? And what would be best for Puerto Rico? We'll come to that in the next section. So with this as a bit of the frame, going on to the next page. What gets people excited about this opportunity is that there is, in fact, a number of products and segments, types of products, that could be ripe for moving. And so I'll orient you to this slide. You see both biopharma and medtech broken out on the left, and then high and medium potential. So high potential would mean things that are medically necessary or COVID medically necessary in the case of medtech, and don't have the full supply chains in the US, so they may have some risk in their supply chains, or have other inherent supply chain risks, have shown outages, have shown stockouts, et cetera, which might need to be reinforced in the US. So again, those are broken between high and medium. High really means the truly essential. Medium means maybe less essential, but still could be somewhere that there would be opportunity. And you see big numbers in terms of the US sales projected out to 2026 in these segments, numbers of products. And in fact, an important point, actually a number have owners or original manufacturers of these products that are based in Puerto Rico or have experience with Puerto Rico already. And so we'll come to what the implication of that is, but it's an important note. The thing that I'd say is, first, a number of these products, almost all of them in fact, have portions of supply chains that already run through the US. So when you think about a middle of the road scenario, as opposed to the full supply chain needing to be in the US, how much is actually going to move? How much are they going to feel the impetus to move versus just changing an inventory strategy and stockpiling inventory? And second, again, it does come back to those scenarios. While mostly upstream, as was noted up front, the APIs, the raw materials, those are largely produced outside of the US. What is going to be the impetus to move when even in Puerto Rico, nonetheless the broader US, it's likely to be a higher cost. And the US is also fighting against higher drug prices and wanting to bring drug prices down. So again, big numbers at the aggregate level, but I think it's then important to try to dimensionalize what's the real opportunity for Puerto Rico in all of this, and the opportunity even for the US more broadly. If you move to the next page. A couple major messages that we heard when we were doing stakeholder interviews from this and actually running industry roundtables on this very topic. First, companies are expecting that what they're going to do is creating redundancy in the supply chain to reduce risk of disruption versus fully exiting China or India, especially China, which is an important market in of itself, large and growing much more rapidly than the US. Exiting China altogether, not expected to be a move most companies are going to make. So again, wanting to reinforce, not build entire new supply chains. And then the second point on the left is expanding or leveraging underutilized capacity in existing facilities. Less talk of building new facilities to support manufacturing shifts with an exception, which I'll come to. But broadly, even as you look at the news and you see some of the recent news that have come out of announcements or proclamations and government mandates or loans that have been given, it's for companies to expand on their existing capacity within the US versus go open new facilities with very, very rare exceptions. So what does this mean for Puerto Rico? Well, prioritize branded companies. And when you say branded companies, we mean the branded pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer or the generics like a Mylan or a Teva, those companies, or OEMs. OEM stands for Original Equipment Manufacturers in MedTech, which are the Medtronic Strykers of the world that have and make essential products for the US market and also have an existing footprint in Puerto Rico. I think the good news is that's actually a lot of them. And that's a number that have pieces of the supply chain of these mission critical categories. So that's not a small list of companies. And also that have the value chain manufacturing footprints or redundancies with the rest of the US. They might not have it, although most of these companies have multiple facilities. They're larger companies, and not all products are made in the US, but ex-US materials or API could in fact move, as has been brought up. A few companies might think about consolidating, even if they weren't required to move the upstream steps, they might think about consolidating in one location in the US. The other acronym that I'd point out here in the second point on the right is CDMOs, which is Contract Development and Manufacturing Organizations. You also may have seen the acronym CMO, Contract Manufacturing Organization. These are third parties that will do the manufacturing on behalf of a Pfizer, a GSK, a Medtronic, the larger pharmaceutical and med tech companies. And interestingly, they could be a piece of the answer here because they can pool volumes across a number of different companies. So if 3 different biopharmas have products that they need to reinforce a US supply chain for, they may work with a contract development and manufacturing organization or CDMO to have that CDMO expand or open a new facility with commitments to manufacture there. And through a number of conversations with the CDMOs themselves and with industry, this is something that could be quite interesting, and it's somewhere where Puerto Rico is extremely well positioned, given the, as Mr. Esco said, the infrastructure and a number of facilities that are shells right now not being utilized that are brownfield would be able to get up to speed faster than building a brand new site from scratch. So again, just to dimensionalize it, size of the opportunity, where is it likely to come from, and who would that opportunity sing to, and how would that speak to prioritization for Puerto Rico? If you move to the next page, and do recognize it's a little bit of a whirlwind, but there's a longer report that'll be available with more of the details. Danny mentioned upfront wanting to compare and contrast Puerto Rico versus other US options under the umbrella of insuring. Puerto Rico, we know, has a number of strengths. Puerto Rico does have some perceived challenges, but I'd say the punchline of all of this is on the right-hand side, we compared Puerto Rico to established manufacturing locations in the US, as well as compared it to economically distressed zones and tested it with a number of industry stakeholders if they were making decisions of where to put and move volumes. And the punchline of the answer is versus the established manufacturing locations, Puerto Rico does have some things to overcome. And in general, especially if you're thinking about high-end biologics or vaccines or new modalities versus a Massachusetts, California, New Jersey, North Carolina, Research Triangle Park, it's not seen as being on the same level in terms of alternative. But versus the economically depressed zones or distressed zones, seen as a very, very strong option. And in fact, at a cut above those options, because of all of the strengths that have been discussed and the history of excellence. And so this will have an implication as we think about what to do from a legislative perspective, recognizing where Puerto Rico will most effectively compete versus where it may not compete as well. Of course, there's nuances to this in certain modalities or certain types of manufacturing like small molecule. It has a stronger track record and would be more attractive versus in some biologics or in cell therapy, for example. But largely, this comparison and this compare-contrast holds true. If you then move to the next page, broadly, I talked a little bit about this already, but where does that leave you in terms of how to prioritize and what to do in terms of the outreach? Now, the 2 top buckets in terms of the multinational companies on the biopharma side, MNCs, or the large OEMs, original equipment manufacturers on the med tech side, we would recommend prioritizing outreach to those that are already on the island to ensure that volume stays on the island, but also explore the opportunities with the products that are most at risk and have the most risk of moving to bring more of those or bring them all together onto the island from an expand perspective as opposed to building new facilities. The next point is both across biopharma and medtech, working with some of the top contract manufacturing or contract development and manufacturing organizations to explore how Puerto Rico might be a piece of the solution and what they bring to their customers who are asking more than they ever have in the past about how to create and reinforce US supply chains. And then lastly, is a bit of a second priority, smaller to mid-sized companies that may not have full manufacturing networks yet. And a number of them who we spoke to talked about Puerto Rico as a fantastic partner in the early stages and the growth stages. That's something that would honestly you do whether COVID was happening or not, or whether insuring was happening or not. But I would say can be a piece of the puzzle, especially mid to long term, More near in would be the idea of these multinational companies and large OEMs and the contract development and manufacturing organizations that have expressed a significant willingness to speak with Puerto Rico about what the art of the possible could look like in the overall insuring picture. And with that, I know a little bit of a whirlwind tour, but I'd like to pass it over to John to talk about what are the implications from a legislative perspective and the size of the opportunity.
Thanks, Aaron. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's go to the next slide, please. So if you look at how we assessed the various companies, and really, as Danny and Aaron have both mentioned, it's really a product story. We took a look at a very large funnel to determine which products and therefore which companies would be most likely to be onshored. Point one, we initially looked at over 540 companies, 2,600 products, narrowed that list down to about 55 companies and about 130 products, and then further refine that based on two assumptions. Our role here was not to pick a particular type or a particular piece of legislation, and there are about 15 different proposals floating around in Congress that I would consider series proposals. But we group those, and there are lots of other things going on in terms of incenting onshoring manufacturing, like tariffs, like protections for procurement, et cetera. We really limited those down to two types of proposals. One, those that call for an economic distress zone, and second, those proposals that called for the elimination of the GILTI tax. For economic distress zones, the important thing that most of the legislation that's proposed out there is it is pretty substantial incentives for wages and for depreciation. So what types of companies and therefore what types of products would be incented under this type of scenario? And as Aaron has mentioned, you've got a set of companies like CMOs, contract manufacturing organizations, that are very cost conscious. They are very focused on return on investment. That's a different focus than, say, a large pharmaceutical company who is very high margin, less concerned about costs. And in terms of where they locate, they're much more interested in located around centers of excellence that already exist in the United States, in places like California, Massachusetts, Indiana, et cetera. So as we looked at the type of products that would be attracted to these two broad categories, for the left-hand side of the slide you're reviewing, for economic development zones, you're going to look at lower margin companies and also the contract manufacturing organizations that can either expand their footprint in Puerto Rico, or given, as we've talked about, the brownfield developments, meaning empty sites ready to be turned into a manufacturing site. Those would be very attractive because if you're going to get a lot of incentives under an EDZ program, you're going to get that for depreciation, you're going to get that for hiring workers, which is what those very margin-focused, cost-conscious companies are interested in. On the other side of the coin, for the GILTI elimination, it's going to attract a different type of company, therefore a different set of products. The challenge, though, is, as I mentioned, is they're not necessarily, while they would, if in all the conversations we had with the branded pharmaceutical companies, they would tell you, we want GILTI elimination because they have a lot of intangibles, therefore they pay a lot of GILTI tax. So eliminating that tax would be a priority for them, as you would expect. The issue, though, is twofold. Number one, because of the reasons I mentioned, that they want to, their positioning, say, vis-a-vis Puerto Rico, is they want to be near those centers of excellences that they are already close to, and the labor that's associated with those facilities. So they're not interested in moving, number one. And number two, the concern that I think is rightfully shared by those in Puerto Rico is that the GILTI elimination, while eliminating a tax, may not provide the right economic incentives, specifically employment for Puerto Rico. So there's concern that it would be simply, a tax play, if you will, but not necessarily give Puerto Rico what it wants ultimately, which is more manufacturing jobs, more tax revenue associated with manufacturing. So what does this net down to in terms of our modeling? And it's important to note in the economically distressed zones that the tax credits would be a key assumption, and we're not tax experts at BCG, but a key assumption in our economic modeling is that the tax credits being proposed in the economic distress zones would be creditable, allowable at the US parent level. That's a key assumption here, and that's important to understand. What does that mean? So we looked at this in terms of modeling out to 2026. We believe that would result, based on the different products that we spoke to companies about, assessed in terms of what their desire would be to move or expand to Puerto Rico, up to $4.5–5 billion in manufacturing value by 2026. That means the value of products shipped back into the United States by 2026. Similarly, that would represent about 3,000 additional FTEs. So that would be that in versus today in Puerto Rico, and anywhere from 70 to 220 million in tax dollars to Puerto Rico. Those tax dollars represent two things. So we just looked at two components of tax. One is your corporate income tax, and secondly is the existing excise tax. In contrast, for GILTI, in that same period of time, our model would show anywhere from $500 million to $2.5 billion in manufacturing value to Puerto Rico by 2026. A little bit less in terms of FTEs, employees on the island, 500 to 1,400. And again, a lower value in terms of tax dollars, 35 million to 105 million, again, for those two combined taxes, excise and corporate tax. Let's move to the next slide, please. So
Thank you, John.
that's for you, Danny. Sorry, I apologize.
No problem. Thank you, John. So let me just summarize quickly and then talk about plan forward, and then we'll end for questions, Mr. Chairman. So just to summarize, there is an opportunity for Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico does have some competitive advantages as laid out by Mr. Esco. There is a potential wave of inshoring. And what we've worked to do is dimensionalize both the size of that opportunity and what that wave will look like. And dimensionalizing that wave, Puerto Rico now has a sense of what those key products are and those companies are that will be most likely to be impacted and or potentially look at moving generally to the US or inshoring some of their supply chain. And then which of those may be most attractive specifically to Puerto Rico. And then lastly, there is differences in the legislation and the impact the legislation will have on Puerto Rico. And with some key assumptions, there is a preferred legislation that we've identified. And in terms of action plan, these companies are thinking about their options now. They're having conversations now. We would encourage Puerto Rico to be part of those conversations, be part of that outreach, to be part of that planning, to be proactively on the option set of these companies as they're working through their plans. And then of course, continuing to monitor the situation and adapting those conversations and those plans as legislation evolves. And then lastly, sort of a no lose situation here is to continue to refine the marketing messages and the positioning for Puerto Rico. In our conversations, there were different perspectives, different views on the current competitive position of Puerto Rico between companies and even within companies. And this is an opportunity for Puerto Rico to own that message, define that message, and continue to promote that message while continuing to invest in it, in the island and its positioning. The last slide here just captures, if you go to the next slide, just captures some additional thoughts out of scope, Mr. Chairman, that we did not spend time going deep on, but as part of the exercise, there were other considerations that companies raised, other potential options for legislative support, both on the federal and local level, that they'd be interested in seeing discussed as part of a longer term plan, potentially and continued support for Puerto Rico's position, and as well as some additional changes and investments in Puerto Rico, infrastructure, energy, et cetera. Things that would continue to strengthen Puerto Rico's competitive position, not just for these manufacturers, but overall for other companies and economic growth. We'll end there, and thank you again for the time.
Thank you to the members of the Boston Consulting Group for their work and presentation. Do the members of the board have questions for BCG?
Let me, if I may, Mr. Chairman, ask the BCG to perhaps elaborate a little bit on the final point, literally the final bullet in the presentation. A lot of what the presentation discusses involves federal action, legislative action, strategic action, somewhat outside our control, although we certainly should mobilize to lobby the initiatives that would be favorable to us. But I think I would like to hear a little bit more from the group concerning what Puerto Rico itself can do to improve its value proposition for investors in these specific industries. You pointed out some of them briefly at the end: infrastructure, utility reliability, perhaps issues relating to permitting, labor, training, and resources, and cost of doing business in Puerto Rico in general. Would you care, anybody from the group, to perhaps elaborate on the significance of those components? Is it minor as compared to the federal action that we might hope for, or is it something that would be material in the overall decision by a company to consider Puerto Rico at this moment?
Great, thank you. And thank you for the question. So let me take that on a couple different ways. There's a lot there. I'd say, regardless of the legislation, to your point, regardless of the federal legislation, if you took that off the table, companies are still thinking about their plans, right? There are companies in Puerto Rico that are champions for Puerto Rico and believers in Puerto Rico, and their future is tied to the success of Puerto Rico, a continuing talent base, continuing ecosystem, continuing to be fruitful. And regardless of the legislation, there are pressures that for inshoring, for strengthening your supply chain, for making it more resilient. So companies are thinking about these options and thinking about their growth independent of federal legislation, to your point. And in pretty consistently in these conversations, they were looking to the kind of investments you talked about to continue to remain competitive, right? Puerto Rico, some time ago, Puerto Rico was in a different competitive position with 936 and almost didn't have competition in the way it does today with a number of countries now offering alternative options, right? And so Puerto Rico needs to continue to invest in that ecosystem and continue to grow that. I'd say it's the infrastructure investments, as you highlighted, it's the talent pool that was talked about, and continuing to nurture, incentivize, retain that talent pool. It's the broader ecosystem and maintaining sort of the continued growth of your supplier network. And then also just stability in all the different senses, tax stability, which you all will know much better than we do. And then just financial, political stability and getting to that sense. So those are all, to your point, very important, and will have incremental impacts regardless of federal legislation.
Thank you. That's very, very useful.
Any other questions from any other member of the board? Okay, well, thank you very much to BCG. There being no further questions, I would like to ask for a motion to enable the board's next steps with regards to this topic.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would then like to move that we formally request that the board's executive director design and roll out a proactive strategy to support and encourage federal legislation to maximize the potential of pharma and medical device manufacturers to move supply chains back to the United States, and in particular to Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. Do we have anybody second that motion?
I'll second that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Skill. Then let me ask for a vote by voice. First, those in favor, please say yes.
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 And those opposed, please say no. Okay, all of the members having voted in favor of the motion, the minutes are approved. Thank you. I understand that Mr. Marrero wants to say a few words, so please, Mr. Marrero.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. I hope that you are able to hear me loud and clear. Thank you, board member, for this initiative. I believe it is a good blueprint, and it will serve to complement the government efforts. However, I would like to clear something for the record. I believe part of this study, I remember that in 2012, I believe the Boston Consulting Group did similar work. So it's great to have most recent data as well as the federal counterpart in order to have a more comprehensive picture. However, I think that it is very important to understand, and for the people of Puerto Rico to know, that for the last 3.5 years, the government of Puerto Rico has been actively working with White House, the Treasury Department, and Congress on a myriad of federal tax policies issues that could have an impact in Puerto Rico's overall economy and recovery efforts. Most recently, we have been working directly with the White House, both Peter Navarro and Peter Brown, the real admiral that serves as a liaison with the White House, in looking for ways to support the enactment of federal tax legislation that incentivize manufacturing operations on the island. Such is the case of the MedTac, the Medical Manufacturing, Economic Development, and Sustainability Act of 2020, which was presented by Representative Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, and which we have been working tirelessly with her, providing a feedback. This bill was filed with bipartisan support and supports the accomplishment of 3 important U.S. policy objectives, which are in full alignment with what BCG just presented. First, it positioned Puerto Rico to build upon its existing medical manufacturing capacity or capability to support establishment of a reliable national medical supply chain from here. Second, establishes incentives, right incentives, to attract medical manufacturing operations in economically distressed zones to help put Puerto Ricans back to work in our nation's hardest hit areas, something that the BCG report just mentioned, which it is in line with our strategy. Third, it also provides a public-private partnership or strategic initiative needed to promote development of advanced medical countermeasures required to protect aging Americans, African Americans, Hispanic American, and all the vulnerable population with chronic underlying conditions from disproportionate severe illness and death in COVID-19 and future epidemics and pandemics. This particularly addressed the qualifying population health products initiative included in the MEDS Act. I should say that we have had over 50 meetings, not only with the Treasury, but also with leading companies of biopharma and medtech. We have agreed to resume talking once again Congress enacts the next stimulus package and determine if it includes any tax provisions related to the need to strengthen the U.S. medical supply chain. Puerto Rico, we believe, is well positioned to contribute and address this national need. We have been working tirelessly in that direction in strict alignment with what the report just said. So again, in general terms, and being as honest as I can be, this report has identified, as it identified back in 2012, many areas in which Puerto Rico can avail itself. However, in addition to that, it also identified the same types of federal tax legislation that we have discussed that could help us in this strategy. So I have to highlight that we see this as a confirmation that we have been on the right path, that we are on the same page. So as always, I'm really glad that we can continue to find areas of collaboration that benefit the people of Puerto Rico, particularly the American citizens residing on the island. On the area that we have some challenges, I think that we agree as well. That's why back in 2018, when we were required to file a recovery plan with Congress, we laid out that the priority in the next 3 to 4 years should be lifeline systems, water, energy, transportation, and communications. The 4 areas which collapsed after Maria, which could also affect, or which actually affected the reliability of the supply chain in Puerto Rico. So again, I welcome the report. I commend the Oversight Board for working on it. I expect additional coordination meetings with the Economic Development Department, the Treasury Department, as well as FOMB, to make sure that we're in alignment with the strategy. But again, thank you, and I think it serves as a good blueprint to continue our efforts together.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Marrero, for your comments. Okay, so let's continue with our agenda. Let's move to the fifth topic, which is the status of the Commonwealth agency consolidations. I believe, Mr. Biggs, that you would like to make a point regarding the Commonwealth's progress in achieving the consolidations and efficiencies among agencies.
Yes, I would. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to 2018, the Commonwealth certified fiscal plans have required the right sizing of government operations by consolidating government agencies and reducing or eliminating certain government services. When the fiscal plan process began back in 2017, the government had approximately 116,500 employees spread across 114 executive branch government agencies, as well as agencies within the legislative and judicial branches. These figures exclude large instrumentalities such as PREPA, PRASA, UPR, and so forth. These agencies were often ineffective and inefficient in delivering the services needed by the people of Puerto Rico, while consuming resources that were excessive compared to the population they served. Even now, compared with states serving similar populations, Puerto Rico remains an outlier in terms of sheer number of agencies. For example, as of 2018, Iowa only had 36 state agencies. Connecticut only had 78 versus Puerto Rico's more than 114. Staffing and managing an organization of this size is challenging even in a stable economic environment. The government has over 100 employees reporting directly to her, making for a practically impossible management task. Moreover, notwithstanding the amount of spending, there are countless examples of subpar service delivery across the government. For instance, as we discussed earlier today, despite having 6 agencies primarily dedicated towards the financial stewardship of the island, the government has been unable to consistently issue consolidated audited financial statements on a timely basis. To assure the delivery of essential services while achieving financial sustainability, the government should have been focusing on operational efficiencies to enable better service delivery in a cost-effective way. A leaner, more efficient, and transformed future government of Puerto Rico should, wherever possible, reflect mainland US benchmarks in terms of both number and size of agencies. The Commonwealth Fiscal Plan requires the consolidation of 125 agencies into no more than 44 agency groupings and independent agencies. In some cases, these consolidations should better focus the competing efforts of multiple agencies, such as the Economic Development Grouping, which is consolidating 10 agencies into just one. In other cases, the consolidations are meant to serve to move services closer to residents, such as the healthcare grouping, which will consolidate access points to important services like Medicaid. Additionally, consolidations will enable agencies to streamline back office processes, eliminate duplicative resources, and benefit from procurement efficiencies. In addition to agency consolidations, the fiscal plan outlines operational and process improvements that must be made to more efficiently use resources, including staff, equipment, services, and buildings, across agency groupings such as education, corrections, health, and public safety. The goal is to improve the quality of the underlying services for the population while also directing valuable resources towards priorities and achieving the cost savings needed to balance the government budget. These measures were developed through an iterative process with the government and are designed to ensure compliance with necessary savings targets without compromising the quality of public service delivery on the island and actually improving it in many cases. Mr. Chairman, we know there has been little progress in this area. This year, especially given the delay in incremental savings, the government should focus on kickstarting the consolidation processes that have not been initiated and should finalize those processes that already have been started. I'm interested in bringing to the people of Puerto Rico a detailed report on the status of the Commonwealth's agency consolidations, along with the board's proposed next steps in light of the lack of action. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. Would any member of the board like to make a motion to this effect?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make that motion. I'd like to move that we ask the board's executive director during the next public meeting to provide a detailed report on the status of the Commonwealth's agency consolidations, along with the proposed next
Sounds like
step.
you're listening to some awesome.
Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Skill. Does anyone want to second that motion?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'll second the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. Then let's ask for a vote by voice. First, those in favor,
Good
please
man.
say
So
yes.
look, on the proposal, like it-
Yes.
You're all about the retainer and just having us.
I think there's somebody speaking that should go in mute, please. Thank you. Okay, then those opposed, please say no. All of the members have voted in favor of the motion. The motion is approved. Thank you. So now we move to our sixth topic on the agenda, which is the annual report for the board. Section 208 of PROMESA requires the Oversight Board to submit an annual report to the U.S. President, Congress, the Governor, and the Legislature of Puerto Rico 30 days after the last day of each fiscal year. Ms. Jaresco, can you please provide an update as to this matter?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last Friday, on July 31st, the board submitted its fiscal year 2020 report pursuant to Section 208 of PROMESA. And as you've mentioned, the report was sent to the U.S. President, to Congress, to the Governor, and the Legislature of Puerto Rico. The report includes, first, the progress made by the territorial government in meeting the objectives of PROMESA during the fiscal year, as well as the assistance provided by the Oversight Board to the territorial government in meeting the purposes of PROMESA during this fiscal year. This section is divided into fiscal responsibility and access to capital markets for the Commonwealth and each of the instrumentalities with fiscal plans and budgets. Second, the precise manner in which funds allocated to the Oversight Board under Section 107 and, as applicable, Section 104E have been spent by the Oversight Board during the fiscal year. And third, it includes other activities of the Oversight Board during the fiscal year, including stakeholder engagement, education, ethics, litigation, amongst others. And fourth, a substantial effort was made in developing recommendations to the President and Congress on actions that the federal government could take that would assist the territorial government in complying with the certified fiscal plan. Among others, the annual report encourages the federal government to pursue swift actions to provide disaster relief funding for Puerto Rico in light of the destruction caused by Hurricanes Irma and Maria, as well as this year's earthquakes. The funding is welcomed, deserved, and much needed by the U.S. citizens living in Puerto Rico. Second, to grant a temporary Jones Act waiver for shipment of LNG within the United States, allowing for the use of foreign flag vessels while American Jones Act qualified carriers are being built. Some U.S. jurisdictions, including Puerto Rico, are currently forced to buy LNG from foreign suppliers to meet their respective energy needs. Thus, this waiver would allow these jurisdictions to buy American LNG. Next, legislate a long-term Medicaid program solution to mitigate the drastic reduction in federal funding for health care in Puerto Rico that happens each time temporary extensions are believed to be expiring. Next, amend federal law so that Medicare beneficiaries in Puerto Rico are automatically enrolled in Medicare Part B with the option to opt out of coverage, the same way their counterparts in every state and territory are treated. Next, to provide equitable treatment to residents of Puerto Rico in all Medicare programs. Residents of Puerto Rico pay the same level of Medicare taxes as mainland residents, but the island receives substantially lower payments in Medicare programs and substantially lower payments to healthcare providers, which affects the island's ability to attract and keep healthcare providers on island. Next, we recommend that Congress explore ways to minimize the challenges and maximize the opportunities of extending a federal earned income tax credit to residents of Puerto Rico, as it would support the locally implemented earned income tax credit, which seeks to promote more formal labor force participation, especially amongst low to moderate income workers. In addition, to collaborate with the government of Puerto Rico to institute a work volunteer requirement to be implemented by July 1st, 2022 for able-bodied participants aged 18 to 59 to receive the Nutritional Assistance Program, or NAP, which is Puerto Rico's largest welfare program. This work requirement should be established in accordance with the Commonwealth Fiscal Plan. Next, to begin using the Department of Health and Human Services, or HSS, poverty guidelines to set the income limits that determine who is eligible for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's housing assistance in Puerto Rico, as it does in mainland states. If this change were to be applied, more people could enter the formal labor market without the risk of losing housing assistance in the process. To provide additional NAP funding to allow the government of Puerto Rico to continue providing NAP benefits to the island's most vulnerable populations while the island recovers from the economic distress COVID-19 continues to cause. To allow Puerto Rico to participate in the pandemic EBT program so that Puerto Rico can provide benefits on EBT cards to replace the value of school meals for children who would ordinarily receive free or reduced price meals, but whose schools may be closed for at least 5 days as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. To extend the full federal child tax credit to residents of Puerto Rico to allow otherwise eligible families in Puerto Rico with 1 child or 2 children to claim the additional child tax credit. This legislative change would provide the same treatment to families in Puerto Rico with 1 child or 2 that's currently provided to families on the island who have 3 or more children, and to families across the 50 states and the District of Columbia. The Congressional Task Force report includes estimates claiming that this proposal itself could benefit about 355,000 newly eligible families and 404,000 newly eligible children in Puerto Rico, with an average credit for all Puerto Rico families of $770, which would help to reduce child poverty on the island. Next, to address Puerto Rico's nutrition disparities by transitioning the island into the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, to ensure equitable treatment in federal food nutrition assistance. And finally, to extend both the federal COVID-19 related unemployment benefits and the Extended Paycheck Protection Plan, PPP, for small business as a result of the ongoing economic distress caused by COVID-19. This report is published and available on the Oversight Board's website, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jaresco, for your report. I'll stay with you as we go to the public comments, which now I believe you will proceed to read the questions that were received through our website and then provide answers to those questions.
The first question from Andrew Faust. He asks, in December of 2019, a FOF completed a restructuring support agreement with 92% of the PREFA Ports bonds, consisting of a group of sophisticated institutional holders. The Oversight Board approved of the restructuring agreement under Section 207 of PROMESA. What steps does the board intend to take to address the recovery for the remaining 8% of the holders, which are held predominantly with smaller retail investors? Will those holders be treated equally as the large institutional holders were in December? The board is aware of the situation. We're discussing it with a FOF, and if Mr. Morero wants to comment, I see him nodding. You're on mute.
Sorry, Mr. Jaresco, thank you for the opportunity. Yes, there's an agreement to treat them the same way. I believe the amount, it is in an escrow account, waiting for that resolution.
Thank you. The next question from Luis Zavala. He asks, interesting to know what has been accomplished that has not been postponed due to the natural disasters recently experienced. For example, technology, excessive government, consolidation of municipalities and agencies, etc. Mr. Zavala, I think one of the most important things that has been accomplished over the past 4 years of the board's existence here is to establish the fiscal plans for most entities, which provide a 5-year path and a plan for each year moving towards those paths. As a result, we've been living within budgets that we believe are sustainable. Without the board and these associated fiscal plans, the projections show that the government spending would have ballooned from $19 billion in fiscal year 2018 to $22 billion in fiscal year 2025, or an increase of 16%. Instead, in these fiscal plans, and to date, we've contained expenditure increases to 2% in that same period of time. And so we've done this at the same time as providing valuable investments into frontline services in the wake of all of these crises. Aside from living within the budget, we've been able to prepare for emergencies, which the government has been able to respond to on a timely basis, unlike after Hurricane Maria. With the emergency reserve that was proposed and established by the government in the budget, they are able to respond immediately to crises, minimizing the effect and supporting the people of Puerto Rico. Recently, that fund was replenished by the legislature in the amount of $536 million. Important that we were also able to budget and to disperse $787 million as part of the package of responding to COVID. The government worked with the board quickly to be able to provide support to frontline workers, to those self-employed and small businesses that were most affected, and also to provide funding for supplies and equipment that were necessary as COVID occurred. From another perspective, we've done a great deal over the past 3 years to ensure that the retirees were receiving their payments in full and on time, despite the fact that the pension funds were virtually unfunded at the moment that Promesa was adopted. Since then, the defined contribution system for existing employees has been put in place, and it is functional. And last but certainly not least, possibly one of the most important things that we believe has occurred despite all of the events of the past and the delays, is the transformation in the electricity sector moving forward. First, an independent regulator has been put in place that gives assurance to the market that rates will be set appropriately without politicization. That regulator is appropriately funded and has the ability to respond to market needs and market players. And second, most recently, the P3 transaction entered into by the government with Luma to manage the transmission, the grid system, is critical to enabling, again, the depoliticization of the management of the electricity grid. Continuity, stability, reliability, and reliance. That isn't the end of the transformation of PREPA and the electricity system, but it is a huge plus and a huge important integral part of that. There are many other individual things, but I'm giving you a selection. I urge you to read through the annual report, which will have additional. The only thing I'd add, just thinking about your question, you asked about consolidation. I'd give 2 examples where consolidation has moved forward in government, and that is with the Department of Economic Development, or DDEC, which is completing this year its consolidation, and in the Department of Public Safety, where consolidation occurred last year and is moving forward. The next question comes from Sandra. What is your opinion of the retirement projects for public employees approved yesterday by the governor? Is there the possibility to approve them? If not, why not? Again, I want to repeat that when the board's work began, the pension funds were virtually unfunded. The employment retirement system was close to 0% funded, and we have been working with the government to ensure pensions can be paid within the ability of the sustainability of this government. On the 2 pieces of legislation, what we've asked for is a complete analysis of the outcomes of this legislation, what they will cost based on actuarial reporting, what the documentation supporting these would be. There is a process that we abide by under Promesa, and that process basically requires the government, after the signing of the law, to provide the fiscal board with a certificate of compliance. They have 7 days to submit the legislation to the board, along with an estimate of the impact on the revenues and expenditures, and to certify that it complies with the fiscal plan. We have expressed our concern that these are not compliant with the fiscal plan, but we await the certification of the government for the final detail on the figures. In general, the government should have scored these laws prior to their enactment, so we expect that we will be receiving these certifications within the 7 days in accordance with Promesa. The next question from Diana Rodriguez. Would you consider paying the teaching career to the almost 200 teachers that we have pending from 5 years ago? We studied and we are paying our student loans, and the Department of Education has not complied with its part of the agreement. We deserve that they do us justice. Honestly, Ms. Rodriguez, I'm not sure what program this refers to. We will look into what is the teaching career program that you mentioned, but I don't have any information to offer you at this point. I don't know what it is. Alberto Ocasio asks, will you consider reducing the excise payments, excise duties on cars? Thank you for the question, Mr. Ocasio. We cannot argue at this point that excise duties are high on cars in Puerto Rico. We don't see that they are in any way out of the norm. But before they could be changed, the government would need to find a pay-for, a way to balance that in the loss of revenues. So we would not consider a reduction in revenues, especially at this time. and we don't in general, unless there is another piece of legislation or a supporting proposal that would increase revenues in some other way or reduce credits or expenditures in some other way. Luis Pabon Bosques writes, hello, I'm an employee of the police of Puerto Rico. Law 447 was signed yesterday. Bill 1623 of dignified retirement. Does this bill have your approval? Does it fit into an economic reality? Furthermore, the Oversight Board approved last December an incentivized retirement for the civilian employees of Puerto Rico Police. Similarly, with this law, we do not believe that we have raised our concerns in writing to the legislature and the government that it is inconsistent with the fiscal plan and that the cost of this legislation is not included, nor will it be consistent. That said, the governor has 7 days after the signing of the legislation to provide us the legislation along with an estimated impact of on revenues and expenditures and a certification that it is indeed compliant. If it is not compliant, it cannot be implemented. Right now, we await the government's submission, and we hope that we will get it in a timely basis. Jerry Vega writes, why at this juncture and after 20 meetings hasn't the board urged the government to start paying bonds? There are hundreds of Puerto Ricans that invested in these bonds, putting their retirement in danger, since the government would demand these brokerage firms that they had to invest 65% in government bonds. Mr. Vega, the board has worked with the government for 3 years and recently actually succeeded in announcing an amended plan of adjustment to restructure $35 billion in Commonwealth liabilities and some $50 billion in pension liabilities. We were very close to reaching an agreement that would restructure the bonds in a way that we thought at that time was sustainable. Unfortunately, although we believe we were close to ending the bankruptcy and resuming payments on restructured bonds, the situation that arose as of COVID-19 forced us to step back, to put that on hold, and to take a new look at the sustainability, the ability of Puerto Rico to pay the bonds that need to be restructured. And we are in the process of reviewing that right now, and that restructuring is on hold as a result. We too wish to bring this restructuring to an end. We believe that it must be brought to an end quickly for Puerto Rico to resume both having access to credit in the markets, but also to attract investment and to overcome the difficulties that have occurred as a result of the debt situation. Roberto Santiago Negron writes, does the Oversight Board have the authority or jurisdiction to place a cap on the expenses of politicians regarding wages and contracts? Can the Oversight Board act in order to validate the referendum in which the people voted for one house, unicameralism, if this would cut expenses in government spending? The Oversight Board has authority over the budget in a process outlined in PROMESA. We work with the government and the legislature to try and achieve a budget in a collaborative process that's consistent with the fiscal plan. And then we monitor and we ensure that that budget is implemented during the course of the year such that there's no overspending. And we've been successful in doing that. So we do certify the budget for each agency, and each agency's specific line items, salary, professional services, at a very detailed level. If you look online, you'll see that detailed level of budget. We don't get involved in the political question of unicameralism or a single house, although we do certify the budget of the legislature. Pete Castillon asks, why is it taking so long to implement a centralized financial management office? Does the legislature understand the importance of this? Mr. Castellon, I think that was the subject in some way of today's meeting, was to ask why it takes so long. And for each element, there were reasons. I'll turn it to Omar Marrero, the CFO of the government, if he wants to comment on the reasons for why it takes so long.
Being honest, I think it's an issue of public policy. So again, with the political transition, we opted to work in a different way, however coordinated. But as we have agreed with the oversight board, once it was included in the certified fiscal plan, we're going to be working with the oversight board to make it a reality. Not only we're going to be working with them through consultants that that will be provided by the oversight board to finalize the centralization of financial management component, but also as to the approval of the law is a matter of definitely it's not it is not only subject to the executive branch, it also requires the approval of both houses to the extent it will be a legislative bill. So it's a matter of public policy, and obviously it's not an easy task as other consolidation had happened.
I have been asked to correct a remark that I made earlier. Excise duties on cars, I cannot argue that they are not high, they appear to be high. However, to change them, there needs to be a pay for such that the revenues of the budget do not decline. The next question, there are two more. The next question from Carlos Munoz. Christmas bonus, salary increases, more and more money. When will it stop? Does the governor and the legislature understand that the money they play with is not theirs? Please stop fiscal mismanagement once and for all. There's not really a question to me there. Omar, do you want to comment?
I'm sorry. The way that we see it is that the Christmas bonus is part of the compensation of public employees, as opposed to other jurisdictions. In the case of Puerto Rico, that Christmas bonus, more than a bonus, is part of the compensation. So if you could call it, it would be the supplemental income that it will try to bring that public servant or that salary to the level or close to a level in the state side or in the nation. So it's a matter of public policy. Once again, we don't see it as free money. It's part of this compensation, and it's mandated by statutory law.
The next question came for the Secretary of Hacienda, Secretary Perez, from a Big Four accounting firm managing partner. Do you believe it is possible to catch up and issue fiscal year 21 statements on a best practices basis by the end or near the end of 2021? Does Hacienda have access to contractors now? What are those contractors doing? Are they expected to do what they're doing with deadlines? Do the contracts have deadlines?
Yeah, the contractor has deadlines. We have a budget. Last year was around almost $10 million with respect to the contractors that were used for the preparation of the financial reporting. Certainly, increasing the scope might need certain changes in the terms and of the contracts embedded. We will review the proposal made by the board. We will take a look how realistic we can implement that with the resources that we have right now. Certainly, it's an aggressive timeline, but we will monitor that. We will review that, and we will provide our comments in the 15-day time frame.
Thank you. Those are all the questions that we've received on our public website, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Jaresco, for running the public comments, and thank you for the public for their questions. Before we conclude, does any board member have any other matter to discuss today?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I would like to make a statement, if I may.
Please go ahead, Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, it has been almost 4 years since we were appointed to this board for a 3-year term, which officially ended August 31st of 2019. So we have been holding over for almost an additional year. At this moment, with mixed feelings, I really have to communicate to the board and to the management of the board that I have informed the White House that I will not be available to continue holding over in this seat past August 31st of 2020, past the end of this month, and that I am not interested in being considered for reappointment to the board. Changing economic circumstances have increased enormously the demands on my time in my regular day job and make it really impractical to continue devoting the time and effort that that participating in this board requires. I have to say that it has been an enormous privilege to serve on the board for 4 years. And I have to begin by thanking President Obama and the congressional leadership that 4 years ago decided to appoint me to this board. I have to also thank my colleagues on the board, most of whom I did not know when we were appointed to the board. We came from very different backgrounds, most of us, with different points of view, but we were able to make this work in a very collegial and very effective manner. It was truly a tremendous working relationship from the very outset that has been really one of the most positive parts of the experience of being on this board. I must also thank the staff led by Natalie Jaresko, an extraordinary leadership for our staff, and supported by many members of the staff. I'll only mention a few. Natalie's Chief of Staff, Sebastián Negrón Reichard, our General Counsel, Jaime El Khoury, our Deputy General Counsel, Kyle Rifkind, and all the supporting staff that make every day make us work, make us be able to perform our duties every day. Let me also thank all of the board's lawyers, financial advisors, technical advisors, and collaborators. This has been an enormous task for everyone, and the intellectual integrity and the contributions of all of you have been enormously valuable to the work of this board. Now, as to what is Promesa mean and what have we accomplished? You know, I would like to start by making, you know, some brief observations, because I think we lose sight of this in Puerto Rico. Promesa was never meant to be a punishment for Puerto Rico. It sometimes feels when you talk to some people in Puerto Rico that it's somehow a punishment for the Commonwealth. It really is a tool to help Puerto Rico work its way out of financial distress by granting the Commonwealth through this board extraordinary powers to address insolvency in a manner that would not be available, in fact, to other state level entities. So it is a tool. It is a tool to help us in the Commonwealth get through this very difficult situation. It was meant to provide protection for the Commonwealth while the debt is restructured in a fair and sustainable manner. And that is what's driven our work throughout these 4 years. Fair and sustainable debt restructuring in the best interest of the people of the Commonwealth, but also taking into account the reasonable, fair interest of creditors that are also not to be ignored. Now, to achieve this, we needed to do a number of things, some of which we have accomplished, some of which we are in the process of getting done, some of which are still far away. And you've gotten a good summary of all of this in today's discussions, in Natalie's summary a few minutes ago in response to one of the questions. Achieving fiscal equilibrium, sustainable fiscal equilibrium for the Commonwealth is one of the paramount goals of PROMESA. We have made very significant progress in that regard through the mechanism of fiscal plans, to which we've devoted enormous attention and effort to ensure that we bring the Commonwealth within its resources. We need the Commonwealth to be able to sustain its operations within realistic resources. The reason we got to where we are is because we forgot that rule beginning in the early 2000s, when we historically had not really had those concerns. So fiscal plans, fiscal equilibrium, one of the key requirements of PROMESA. We've made very significant progress here. But this was also meant to get us to a point where we could produce audited financial statements in a regular fashion, in a timely fashion. As you've heard today, we are far from getting there. We have made very limited progress in that direction. Yes, there have been all sorts of outside events that have made this more difficult, but the reality is we have to move beyond those events, beyond those obstacles, and we have to really focus on providing audited financial statements. It is our statement to the world. It is our statement to our taxpayers, to our citizens, about the operations of the Commonwealth and where it stands. You cannot have a serious discussion about fiscal equilibrium and sustainability if you don't have audited financial statements for the Commonwealth. So this is still a major unachieved objective that we need to achieve. In fact, it is a requirement to leave PROMESA. Eventually, all of this, and this is a final test in PROMESA, really should lead to recovering access to the capital markets. Puerto Rico needs access to the capital markets. We have not had it for, I think now 7 years, since the last public issue probably by the Commonwealth. It cannot go on forever. No government can sustain its operations or invest in infrastructure for the future without access to the capital markets. The reason Puerto Rico got to where it got, coming from the poverty, abject poverty of the 1930s, was because we began accessing capital markets beginning in the 1940s. And that is what built our infrastructure, our electric power infrastructure, our aqueduct and sewer infrastructure, our highways, our universities, our schools. We need to recover access to the capital markets. It is not possible to sustain economic growth eventually without access to the capital markets. So we need to achieve all the other goals. It's also, by the way, a requirement to get out of PROMESA. All of this, however, to be sustainable requires economic growth, and sustainable economic growth requires a serious introspection as to what works and what doesn't work in Puerto Rico, what our competitive advantages are and what our disadvantages are, what we do to improve our advantages and what we actually do to worsen to destroy our competitive advantages by imposing upon ourselves requirements that make us less competitive. Everything from onerous permitting to unrealistic labor market regulations do not help us achieve sustainable economic growth. And there is enormous reluctance to consider, to even address seriously structural reforms that would lead us to sustainable economic growth. So we could achieve all of the financial objectives of PROMESA, and we could still find ourselves without economic growth, without economic development, without a way forward. So we also must address those issues seriously, consistently for the future. Now, I know there have been difficulties in achieving these goals, many of which are understandable and are completely exogenous to the processes and the politics of Puerto Rico. I'm referring to natural disasters, of which we've had a terrible string of natural disasters, storms, earthquakes, and now a public health crisis that developed into an unprecedented worldwide economic crisis. Yes, there's all of that. But unfortunately, we all have to deal with that. We all have to address that. In fact, the whole world has to address many of these concerns now. And those countries that do not rise to the occasion, that do not call upon their resources, their stamina, their motivation to address this will fall behind, and those that do will recover and come out ahead. So yes, we've been unlucky in many aspects to have to deal with a financial crisis in the midst of everything else that seems to be against us. But in the end, it's no excuse. We have to find our strength to move forward. Now, in addressing all of this, I have to tell you, Promesa has had enormous limitations as a tool, as a statute for addressing all of this. Out of respect for Puerto Rico's sovereignty, out of respect for Puerto Rico's democratic processes, Promesa, unlike what some people may think, did not create a super government on top of Puerto Rico's government. It created an oversight board that works through financial and fiscal means. That's why we work, as Natalie was explaining, answering a question a few minutes ago, through fiscal plans, through a back and forth process that is not the most efficient and that is very slow in many cases to address some of the things that frustrate all of us. But it was supposed to work because it was meant to be a collaborative process between the oversight board and the duly elected government of Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, I have to say that the biggest obstacle in making Promesa work has in fact been the failure of Puerto Rico's governments in the last 4 years to understand that this has to be a collaborative process, not a contentious adversarial process. Unfortunately, we have often found ourselves in a situation where litigation has been pursued too quickly for issues that are ultimately minor, really to play to the local sensibilities without really achieving anything or enhancing the productivity of the process. So this penchant for unnecessary litigation, which unproductively increased expenses of the board and extended the insolvency process, has not been ideal for this, and it's not been, in the end, productive for the process. It has also been very frustrating and very unfortunate that generally successive administrations in Puerto Rico have also been unwilling to contemplate seriously structural reforms which are essential to recovering a path to economic development, as I stated before. This is unrealistic. There has to be a dialogue and a serious introspection as to what we need to do to move forward beyond the basics of fiscal equilibrium. One more item I need to address regarding the performance of our local partners, of the local government, local administration, successive local administrations. We have to seriously address the lack of managerial capability that we continue to run into in our governmental agencies. The lack of execution capability, even when there is an agreement that something has to be done. We continually run into the inability to follow up, to execute, to demand performance, to require results. There is no room for that in this process anymore. There is no room for that taxpayers should allow in this critical situations. We certainly pay high taxes in Puerto Rico, and we certainly should demand results. So we really have to demand managerial accountability and execution at the governmental level. Sometimes it is a result of lack of political will to execute on agreed to initiatives, but sometimes it's just plain ay bendito sort of a result, and everybody who's listening to me in Spanish will understand what that means. It's the willingness to accept excuses and not demand actual results. We have to move beyond that if we're going to eventually return Puerto Rico to where we all want it to be. So let me wrap up here by saying that my messages going forward as I step down from this board to the politicians, to the civil servants in Puerto Rico, to the people who step in to try to move the governmental machinery forward. I would say, you need to stop feeling aggrieved. You have to stop being in denial about what happened to Puerto Rico when it moved into a position of financial insolvency. You have to take responsibility and own the reality that we have. Nobody likes it, but it's there and we have to address it. You have to take responsibility to move the country forward. The solutions are not going to be forthcoming from Washington, D.C. At best, we'll get palliative care from Washington, D.C. But a culture of grievance and dependence, which would be very easy to fall back on with that palliative care, is not constructive in the long term for Puerto Rico's society, for Puerto Rico's economy. It is not what built the modern Puerto Rico. It is not what my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation worked for and brought us here to, and it is certainly not what we want to leave to our children's generation. Now, to those who are not in government and will not be in government, to civil society, not just the so-called private sector, civil society as a whole, meaning not just the business people, but the nonprofit sector, and the regular citizen. I think you have to be more demanding of your government and avoid being co-opted by over-dependence on governmental action and programs. Government of Puerto Rico weighs enormously on the economy of Puerto Rico, and everybody in some manner has some economic interest tied up with the government of Puerto Rico. And that leads to very easily adopting a culture of silence so as not to, quote, offend whoever is in power at the time. It cannot go on. You must carry, the civil society must carry the principal responsibility to raise the country up by its bootstraps, once again, as we did beginning in the 1940s. But it cannot happen if you are silent and complacent. It will not happen. I will end where I began by thanking my colleagues on the board, the staff under the extraordinary leadership of Natalie Jaresco, our lawyers, our advisors, our collaborators. Again, without you, this would have been an impossible task. But the work is far from over. It will continue under a new board or some new members of the board. The work will not get easier, but I do trust that if we all devote ourselves to the truly important things in this process, we will eventually find our way forward. And as a Puerto Rican, I view it as our duty to past and future generations. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez, for your words and for your service, for sharing, your experience with this board. It has been an honor to be able to serve by your side. We thank you on behalf of the board for your many contributions and for the dedication and time that you have provided and advice to this board. And thank you very much for your service.
Yes, Jose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I would just echo that, and really it's been an honor and pleasure to serve with you, and very often a detailed, important education in financial matters as well.
Thank you, Judge.
As always, I agree with everything Jose says. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you, Andrew.
And let me add my thanks as well. As you said earlier in your remarks, one of the most remarkable things about this board, as Arthur mentioned at our last meeting, was as different as we are, we worked as a team. The vast majority of the things we did unanimously. We believe in the same vision for Puerto Rico. And it is hard for me to imagine that you can be replaced in that role. I don't think you can in many respects. And the fact that the president of the New York Federal Home Loan Bank spent 4 years trying to make Puerto Rico a better place is just incredibly powerful and an incredible example for all of us. And I thank you for that. As I said with Carlos and Jose last month, we're not really letting you go. You will be officially not on the board, but you're on this board forever, and I'm grateful for it.
Always at your service, David. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Marrero.
Gracias. Well, from our perspective, I want to thank Jose Ramon Gonzalez, experience, commitment in this role as a professional that I grew up and developed myself watching him as the president of the GDB. And then when I was a young lawyer, Amaguana Valdez, going to Oriental Bank to get a signature from this top-notch professional, and then many spins, and then we are here. So, but for the brief time that I have spent with Jose Gonzalez, I have to commend his professionalism, work ethic, and obviously collaboration with the government of Puerto Rico. So, as a Puerto Rican and as a professional, definitely it was an honor and privilege for me and for the people of Puerto Rico to have you on board once again, making yourself available for public service, obviously in a different perspective, but always making yourself available. That's definitely what all Puerto Ricans would like to see from many leaders. So once again, thank you for making yourself available, and thank you for your contribution during the province.
Thank you, Omar. Siempre.
Is there any other matter that any other member wants to cover today?
Secretary Perez would like to speak, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Secretary, sorry.
No, I'm sorry, just to say thank you to Mr. González. Muchas gracias por su servicio. Bendiciones para usted y su familia.
Muchas gracias.
Okay, if there are no other matters to cover, I move to adjourn the meeting. Is there anybody who seconds that motion?
I will second that motion.
Then I would ask for a voice vote. First, those in favor, please say yes.
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 Very good. All of the members have voted in favor. The meeting is adjourned at 4:29 p.m. Thank you very much for your participation in the meeting today.